My relationship with the wilderness was not merely a hobby, it was a sanctuary, a place where the hardships of daily life was replaced by the peacefulness of nature. The anticipation for my weekend retreat had been building for months, and I continuously planned to travel into the heart of the forest, where I could bask in the serenity of isolation. My girlfriend was supposed to accompany me, but due to a death in her family, she had to drop out of our trip, but did encourage me to continue going alone, since we had planned the trip for a long time, and because I really didn't know her family, so it would be awkward for me to just show up to the funeral. So I comforted her and gave my condolences before heading out to camp. By the time I got to the spot in the forest that I wanted to set up camp, the sun had went down, so I quickly stacked up some firewood and started a fire as I finished setting up my tent before sitting down to eat the sandwich I brought with me. And for a while, things were going normal, and it felt like a typical night in the woods. But that feeling wouldn't last long, because something took place that night that still scares me when I think about it. It started once I began to hear the sound of a man laughing, which was weird since I was deep in the woods. I paused, my heart skipping a beat as I strained my ears to try and hear the noise over the crackling of the bonfire. I couldn't believe it. Someone was out there with me, in a spot I randomly chose to camp, but I shook off the uneasiness, attributing it to the overactive imagination of a lone camper, and I just continued to eat before getting ready for bed. But as I was climbing into my tent, the laughter grew louder, letting me know that the person was getting closer, and the sound began to surround me, as it started to echo throughout the woods, drowning out the sounds of insects and animals. So I did what anybody would do in my position, and that was hide in a nearby bush, especially since I did not know who or what was approaching me. But after sitting in the bushes for like 30 minutes, I didn't see anyone enter my campsite, so I decided to just put out my fire, then get into my tent. However, it was when I was walking back to my campsite when I saw someone moving between the trees, but it was too dark for me to see him fully, and I couldn't make out much. But he seemed to be a tall guy with messy hair, and when he moved, he would bend and tilt his head backwards as he walked around the edge of my camp, back and forth, before he stopped and laughed out, which was pretty creepy to see in person. And it was at that moment that I remembered hearing about a guy who escaped from a local hospital, and I couldn't help but think it might be him. At least, it was a possibility. So I decided to just leave and come back later for my stuff. But that was a mistake, because as soon as my feet pushed down, they would crunch the leaves beneath me, so I started to walk faster, trying to get out of there. But the underbrush was thick, and I kept tripping over stuff. Eventually, I ran as fast as I could before I found a small clearing and hid behind a large log, trying to catch my breath. The laughing had stopped, or he had remained at my campsite, I really didn't know. But it was super quiet, which somehow felt even worse, since I had no clue where he could have been. I didn't know how long I sat there, but I know it was for hours, and before I knew it, I had dozed off. I awoke to the sound of twigs snapping somewhere nearby, so I just sat still for a few more minutes. But when I finally decided to make a run for it, and before I could even stand up, I felt a hand clamp over my mouth, and that's when I heard the same crazy laugh right in my ear. I freaked out and struggled hard, managing to break free after punching the guy multiple times in the face, ahead of me running like I've never ran before. And thankfully I made it back to the road just as the sun was coming up, where I managed to flag down a car. The driver being an older guy who could tell that I was scared to death, so he gave me a lift. I met up with the cops who went to my campsite with me and looked around, but didn't find anyone, and thankfully my tent and belongings were still there. So I just packed up everything and left when the cops did. That night in the woods was the scariest thing I've ever experienced, and I used to love hiking and camping, but after that, I just can't bring myself to go back. And sometimes, when it's quiet, I can still hear that laugh, and it reminds me of how close I came to something really bad happening to me. I've always been an avid camper. The solitude of the forest was my sanctuary. But last summer, I encountered something that turned my peaceful retreat into a living nightmare. It started on a cool night, as the moon shined bright, when I first saw him, a man standing at the edge of my campsite. He was just out of reach of my firelight, smiling in a way that sent shivers down my spine. His eyes, dark and unblinking, were fixed on me, and it creeped me out. But not enough to have me feel the need to flee. Well, that's until his pranking, or whatever it was he was doing, consisted, having me pack up my stuff and move to different spots. And it was a few days that I moved to my camp hoping to shake him, but I would always have the feeling of being watched, and would always see him there, lurking just beyond the trees, his eerie smile unwavering. He never approached, never spoke, just stared with an intensity that made me start fearing for my safety, and I even considered just packing up and going home, and that is one thing I wish I had done. Then came the night that will forever haunt me, and it happened once I awoke to the sound of slow, deliberate movement, causing my heart to begin racing as I realized that someone was inside of my tent. I could feel his presence, hear his shallow breaths, and at first I laid there, paralyzed with fear, too afraid to even move, until I mustered up the courage to turn on my flashlight. So I reached over and grabbed it up, quickly turning it on, and once I did, the light revealed him, the weird man, crawling on all fours, his smile inches away from my face. Our eyes met, and for a moment, time stood still, as if we were paused in a horror movie. Then, as if nothing had happened, he backed out of the tent and disappeared into the darkness. I stayed up the rest of the night, clutching my flashlight, it being the only type of weapon I had to defend myself, but thankfully I did not hear or see him the rest of the night. The next morning, I packed up and left, vowing never to go camping again while alone. I mean, who in the hell stalks someone in the woods? Joking or not, that guy clearly had something wrong with him. Mainly since he took my one chance of peace away from my struggles and hardships. The forest, once my refuge, had become a source of fear and paranoia for me, and I haven't went camping since. I still don't know who he was or what he wanted, but his silent demeanor and haunted smile is burnt into my memory, and it is a scary reminder that we are never truly alone in the wilderness, and animals isn't the only thing you should fear when in the forest alone. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the image of his twisted smile from my mind, as I thanked God that he didn't do more to me than just stare. Lord knows he could have done anything to me that he wanted to, while I laid asleep in my tent. And who knows, maybe that's what he was about to do. That night I caught him crawling in as quiet as he could. Weeks passed, but the fear never left me. I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, convinced that he was there in the corner of my room, watching me. And the boundaries between reality and nightmare blurred until I could no longer tell them apart anymore. I sought help, spoke to a psychiatrist, but nothing could erase the memory of that night. They said it was just a figment of my imagination, a manifestation of the stress and isolation of my time alone in the woods. But I know what I saw, what I felt. It was real as the fear that now consumes my every thought. Now I've given up camping and given up my love for the wilderness. That man stole something from me that I can never reclaim. The forest, once my escape, has become my one fear, and now it's a chapter of my life that I desperately wish to close. I've always been drawn to the woods behind my house, a dense thicket that the locals claim is haunted. I never believed in such tales until one evening when the forest's eerie silence beckoned me to go and explore it. As twilight descended, I ventured into the woods, the fading light not bothering me too much. The air was still, too still, and the usual chorus of wildlife was strangely absent. But I pressed on, driven by my mix of curiosity and somewhat stupidity. I stumbled upon an opening in the woods where the moonlight didn't seem to touch the ground. In the center stood an ancient oak, its branches twisted and withering, yet it seemed to be quite strong. But something unexpected took place there, and I still can't explain it. And that's when I heard something, or someone, a soft whisper, barely audible, calling my name. I spun around searching for the source, but saw nothing. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. I felt a chill run down my spine as the temperature dropped rapidly around me, and trust me when I say, it was cold, and during a midsummer night. My breath formed clouds in the air, and I realized it when I exhaled, and it made no sense whatsoever, and I was beginning to freak out. So I turned to leave, but found myself face to face with a figure shrouded in mist. It had no discernible features, yet I felt it staring into my soul. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. The figure reached out with a hand that wasn't quite there, and I felt an icy grip tighten around my wrist. Panic set in as I struggled to break free from its hold. I managed to wrench myself away, running blindly through the dark, and multiple times I fell down trying to desperately escape whatever it was that was pursuing me. I burst out of the forest, gasping for air, and didn't stop running until I reached the safety of my home. And when I looked back, the edge of the woods seemed to pulsate with a dark energy, as if warning me never to return. I quickly grabbed my phone and called the police, leaving out the detail of me seeing a spirit. I just wanted someone else there, and who better than a cop to be around when scary things are happening? 2 officers arrived about 20 minutes later, and even though I was scared to death, I walked them back to the oak tree where I saw the thing. But I'm sure you guessed it. Nothing was found. But they too felt the cold. To this day, I do not know what the hell it was that I encountered in my woods, or how it or they knew my name. But sometimes, I can still hear it calling out when I'm outside at night. And the scariest thing is that I live alone and have no one to experience this with.